Leaders in global breaking news.
The West is put on guard for Russian cyber attacks, but is business ready? I get the view from the former head of the NSA. I also talk about the threat the war poses to globalization with the head of the WTO. Join me, Aaron Heselhurst, on Talking Business Weekly, here on BBC World News.
Around this table, correspondents from across the globe who file, broadcast and blog from the Dateline London. Fresh perspectives on familiar stories and those you may know nothing about. Join us for a journalistic brains trust from those in the know. Dateline London Weekends on BBC World News.
This is BBC News. I'm Matthew Amroli-Waller. Joe Biden adds his voice to international condemnation after more evidence emerges of atrocities by Russian forces. It comes as President Zelensky visits the town of Bucha and talks of his shock at seeing dead civilians on the streets and mass graves.
It's very difficult to talk when you see what they have done here. And day by day, they find bodies in cellars, people tortured, people killed.
We have to gather all the detail so this can be have a war crime trial. This guy is brutal, and what's happening in Bucha is outrageous, and everyone's seen it.
Russia says the images are staged, but the BBC films evidence and hears first-hand accounts of civilians being killed.
They were in jeeps with guns. They killed him and fled. How can I talk to such morons? I want them dead. I want their children to lie like my son.
I'm Anna Foster, live in Lviv as Ukrainians react to the images of horror they've been seeing.
Also on today's Global Breaking News, an urgent plea from the world's leading researchers on climate change. We need to accelerate radical action to rein in catastrophic global warming. That's according to a UN report just published. And political turmoil in Pakistan. The Supreme Court postpones the decision till tomorrow to block a vote of no confidence against the Prime Minister Imran Khan. Hello and welcome to BBC News. Shocking images of civilian bodies in the streets of Bucha near Kyiv have led to international condemnation of Russia. In the last few minutes, President Biden has again called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. He's also called for increased sanctions and a war crimes trial. Meanwhile, Ukraine's president has been visiting Bucha, where he accused Russian troops of committing war crimes and genocide. Volodymyr Zelensky said Russian troops have treated people worse than animals, with that becoming increasingly clear when Ukrainian fighters retook territory. Well, we'll be live to Ukraine in just a moment or two, but first let's hear from President Biden, who's just been speaking.
You may remember I got criticized for calling Putin a war criminal. Well, the truth of the matter, you saw what happened in Bucha. This warrants him, he is a war criminal. But we have to gather the information. We have to continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons they need to continue the fight. And we have to gather all the detail so this can be have a war crime trial. This guy is brutal. And what's happening in Bucha is outrageous. And everyone's seen it. No, I think it is a war crime.
President Biden in the last little while. Let's head straight to Lviv and back to Anna Foster, who is there for us. And Anna, we've seen these shocking images, more evidence, more accounts from all those places around Kyiv, and President Zelensky seeing for himself and expressing huge amounts of shock.
He has. It's notable as well that we see President Zelensky in the town of Bucha. So far through this conflict, we've seen him almost daily in the surrounds of Kyiv, of course. You have to remember that there is an ongoing threat to his safety as the president of this country. But today he has been to Bucha. He has seen for himself some of those images that have been beamed around the world in the last 48 hours or so. Bucha has endured 5 weeks or so now of near constant firefights, and now officials and human rights groups are blaming the civilian deaths on the departing Russian forces. Let's have a listen to what President Zelensky had to say.
You can see around what was done to this modern town. That's a characteristic of Russian soldiers that treat people worse than animals. That is real genocide. What you have seen here today, what you can see, what happened. We know thousands of people that were tortured and killed, with cut off hands and legs, extremities, and what they did to the women. And I would say that the longer the Russian Federation will drag out the meeting process, the worse will be for them and, in principle, for this situation, for this war. Because with every day when our army are moving into the previously occupied territory, you can see what's happening. It's very difficult to talk when you see what they have done here. And day by day, they find bodies in cellars, people tortured, people killed. So if they have something to think with, they have to think quick.
Well, we are seeing now those images from places like Bucha, which we've seen so little from for the last 5 weeks, but we're also beginning to hear as well the stories and the testimony of people who lived through, frankly, unimaginable scenes there. I've been speaking to some residents of Bucha, people who managed to escape from that town, the areas which have been left devastated during this war. Ukrainian fears have now become reality. In towns around the capital, Kyiv, horrific scenes are slowly revealed to the world. Destruction and death now inhabit these once quiet streets. Places like Bucha have been scarred forever.
Why were ordinary civilians in an ordinary peaceful city tortured to death? How could women be raped and killed in front of children? How could their corpses be desecrated even after death? Why did they crush the bodies of people with tanks? What did the Ukrainian city of Bucha do to your Russia?
Can you show me? Dmytro escaped from Bucha. He showed me his diary and the few pictures he dared to take. We saw the Russian tanks, and we understood that one good shot might finish everything. We saw the bodies that were in the cars. The body of a man on a bicycle who didn't hurt anybody. Every day, Dmytro wrote what he saw and heard, and how he felt, even when he feared death was close. I'm lucky to be alive, he told me. So you thought that you would be leaving this behind, and these would be your final words?
Yeah, I thought that's my final words, to leave something that I was feeling in the last minutes.
The last minutes of your life?
Yeah.
What are your feelings towards the people who did this? Life didn't prepare me for this. That's not what humans should do. Even animals have souls. But this is evil. This is something from another world. While Ukraine has taken back many towns around Kyiv, other cities are still in the grip of fierce fighting. Tens of thousands are still trapped in the southern port city of Mariupol.
You saw these pictures, you saw these videos, and we see that Russian army, they are not human beings. I don't know who they are. Are they animals? Are they orcs? Or who they are? I don't know. How it's possible to do this, I cannot even imagine.
The battle for the south and east of Ukraine goes on. And while the conflict rages, it's hard to know the full extent of the horror that will be left behind. Well, we've just heard from the governor of the Zhytomyr region, which lies west of Kyiv. We've been hearing about these pullbacks of Russian forces, and he has said that there are no Russian troops remaining in that region. He says they have left behind things like parts of their armoured military vehicles, parts of their ammunition, and it continues that trend of Russian forces pulling away from the areas around the capital, Kyiv, and as we fully expect, moving towards places like the east and the south to reinforce their fighting there instead.
And Anna, a question about Mariupol, because only in the last couple of hours the Deputy Prime Minister saying the evacuation buses still not being allowed in. I'm just seeing the ICRC saying they're being kept in a town 20 kilometres west of the port city.
You're right. This started to be a topic of discussion towards the end of last week. Thursday was the day that the ICRC had hoped to be able to get into Mariupol. It didn't happen, nor did it happen on Friday. And again, on Saturday, it was unsuccessful. What they want to try and do is bring out a large number of people, a fleet of buses, they hope, people following in private cars in a convoy. So far, there's been a trickle of people who've managed to get out on their own. But if you think that there are still tens of thousands of people stuck in Mariupol, they really need to start raising those numbers. But they've said they will only do it if the security assurances are there, if the guarantees are there. Of course, remember, Mariupol is strategically important for both sides. Russia wants to use it to create a land corridor between Russia and annexed Crimea. So that is an area where we expect the fighting to continue. Neither side seems to want to stand down, even for a brief period, to take civilians out, because that is an area, a city, that they are both desperate to try and hold.
Anna Foster there in Lviv, thanks very much. Lots of developments in terms of the situation on the ground and diplomatically with Ukraine, so plenty more on today's Global on that, our main story. One other important headline, though, first, because within the last few minutes, the world's leading researchers on climate change have warned that rapid systemic transformation is needed across all parts of society to rein in catastrophic global warming. The UN report demands fundamental changes to the way we generate electricity, the way we travel, heat our homes, what we eat and how we consume. It also calls for the boosting of technologies that suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Well, let's speak now to our science correspondent Victoria Gill, who joins us live on the programme. That news conference is underway as we speak. Just go through the headline conclusions, Victoria.
Well, I think the big headline, Matthew, is this message that it's really now or never, that action needs to be immediate. Deep cuts in our carbon emissions are required now. You know, we heard when we reported from COP26 last year in Glasgow that this was a decisive decade. Now we're seeing a message from this latest report, which is essentially a to-do list on mitigation, about how we deal with, how we offset the worst effects of climate change. And while there is a practical and deliverable to-do list that's all about drastically cutting those greenhouse gas emissions and also using technologies, because we are so tight for time, using technologies that are going to actually suck carbon emissions out of the air to sort of support that transition. It's also a really alarming call to action, because it stresses that we're really running out of time, that emissions need to peak by 2025. Something that put it into perspective for me was a quantification of the time we've got left, of the carbon budget that we've got left that came out of this report, which is that the emissions that globally we have put into the atmosphere in the last decade, that's the volume that we have left in our carbon budget in total for us to keep that global warming below 1.5. So you can sort of see in that quantification the kind of sands running through the hourglass, and that's where this now or never comes into place, because it's a huge transition for all of our economies, and the window is closing rapidly.
It is, and they're talking about accelerating the move away from fossil fuels, obviously, but the Ukraine war complicates things, doesn't it? Because in the search for energy away from Russia, we could even see fossil fuel usage increase in the short term, couldn't we?
Absolutely, we could, and we have. I think in terms of this particular report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are sort of the world's best climate scientists, and they're very keen to steer away from the politics. Essentially, they're putting forward the best evidence they have about what needs to be done and on what timescale it needs to be done in order to fend off the worst effects of climate change. But of course, this report, line by line, has to be gone through and approved by nearly 200 governments. And so I think all of those governments will have been looking at this with a view to safeguarding energy security and obviously the geopolitical concerns around energy that have been brought to the fore by the crisis in Ukraine.
Victoria, thanks very much. Well, that news conference, that announcement just being made, we'll have plenty more on this story too throughout the course of today's Global. Let's, though, turn to the latest in the political crisis in Pakistan, because the Supreme Court is deliberating whether a decision to block a vote of no confidence against Prime Minister Imran Khan was legitimate. Parliament was then dissolved and Imran Khan called for a general election. He claims the vote was part of a US-led conspiracy to remove him. Well, let's speak now to our Pakistan correspondent, Secunda Kamani. He joins us live from Islamabad. And Secunda, the political turmoil, just take me through it, because we were expecting perhaps to hear from the Supreme Court today. Now it's expected tomorrow.
That's right, Matthew. This political drama continues, and it continues to grip the nation. All eyes on the building behind me, or they were during the day. That's the Supreme Court of Pakistan, of course. As you say, we were expecting a decision by the Supreme Court today. Now, quite possible it will be tomorrow, although it could conceivably be delayed further. They're deliberating on whether or not this decision by the Deputy Speaker of Parliament to nullify the vote of no confidence against Imran Khan was legitimate or not. He would have lost that vote of no confidence and been ousted from power. Instead, the Deputy Speaker said that the vote of no confidence was unconstitutional because of allegations Imran Khan and his party have been making that the plot to remove him from power is part of an international conspiracy orchestrated by the United States, they say, in conjunction with his local domestic political rivals. Now, his critics here, his opponents, say that's ridiculous. American officials have said there's no truth in the allegation, but that narrative does seem to be resonating with a significant number of Imran Khan supporters. It seems perhaps that that's the narrative they want to try and propel themselves forward with in any kind of fresh elections. And I was speaking to the information minister, a senior member of Imran Khan's party earlier today, and he was saying, look, we've got this document, which we believe is a diplomatic cable sent by the Pakistani ambassador in Washington to the Foreign Office here, and he was saying we consider it an attempt to effect regime change. Many other analysts are saying they think that's exaggerated. Perhaps there was some undiplomatic, forthright language used in that cable, but it does not amount to evidence of a conspiracy. We haven't been shown the letter, we haven't seen it ourselves, so it's hard to say. But the political turmoil around that letter, around this vote of no confidence, continues.
Briefly, Secunda, the support of the military in Pakistan is always vital. Previously, Imran Khan had it. But what is the current situation?
Exactly, Matthew. And you know, there's a big question that many people might ask of why was this vote of no confidence being held in the first place? It wasn't because there's a sudden upsurge in anti-Imran Khan sentiment. It's because most analysts and observers believe that, as you say, Imran Khan came into power in 2018 with the support of the Pakistani military, but late last year a rift began to emerge between them over key appointments to the leadership of the intelligence services. The opposition, it seems, saw that as an opportunity to try and strike them whilst the military were drawing their support back. Big question about where the military, where their allegiance and what their stance will be going forward, particularly if we see fresh elections as Imran Khan has called for.
Sikandar Kermani there in Islamabad. Thanks very much for the latest. Thank you. Now, still to come on today's programme, accusations of war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. Joe Biden has just called for a war crimes trial. We'll look at the challenges of bringing such a trial and bringing those responsible to justice.
This funeral became a massive demonstration of black power, the power to influence.
Today is about the promise of a bright future, a day when we hope a line can be drawn under the bloody past.
I think that Picasso's works were beautiful, they were intelligent, and it's a sad loss to everybody who loves art.
Welcome back to the programme. Let's get more on those shocking scenes and evidence emerging from the areas around Kyiv with Russia being accused of war crimes. But how challenging is it to gather evidence for any prosecutions? Well, here's our correspondent Paul Adams, and a warning again, this report does contain distressing material.
A war barely 6 weeks old, but a landscape already scarred, littered with the wreckage of two armies locked in combat. But there's more. Shattered neighbourhoods, lives completely upended. And now, stories of horrors inflicted on civilians, allegations of war crimes. In Bucha, close to Kiev, satellite images appear to show a mass grave. Signs of excavation beginning on March the 10th, when Russian troops controlled the area. As Bucha's remaining civilian population grapples with the scale of what's happened to them, the world is asking, who did this? When and why? Talk of atrocities started to leak out via social media within days of Russia's invasion.
It's taken us this time to make absolutely sure that we know these things happened. Yeah? And therefore that evidence is much more difficult for Russia to refute.
As the fighting continues, international outrage mounts, and with it a growing conviction that what we're seeing needs to be examined and perhaps prosecuted.
It is time to do everything possible to make the war crimes of the Russian military the last manifestation of such evil on earth.
But what is a war crime? After the Second World War, Germans were found guilty of genocide and other crimes against Europe's civilian population. Nuremberg, the first tribunal of its kind. 50 years later, Europe reeled in horror once more. Bosnian Muslims, men and boys, soldiers and civilians, caught and executed in cold blood at Srebrenica. It took 12 years to capture, try and convict the Bosnian Serb general Ratko Mladic. At a special tribunal at The Hague, he was accused of genocide and deliberately targeting civilians. When crimes are committed during war, justice does not come quickly. The fighting has to end. Criminals have to be found, handed over. Sometimes political leaders are indicted. But in Ukraine, the case against Russia is starting to build. Paul Adams, BBC News.
Well, I'm joined now by Fatima Liss, Russian-American investigative journalist. Welcome here to the programme. So, flat denials from Moscow in the face of accumulating evidence. That's pretty much the Kremlin's playbook, isn't it?
Yes, it is. We've seen response to the Bucha and Irpin, absolutely flat denials. More than that, they say it was all staged by the Ukrainian side. They say that it didn't happen. If it happened, it was the Ukrainians who did it, and actually it never happened. It's all Russophobia and a propaganda attack to discredit Russia. That's what we hear from all the Russian agencies, from the Kremlin itself.
Is it working, do you think, domestically? Are people believing it?
Absolutely, yes. In Russia, domestically, propaganda works, especially because right now Russia is mainly focused its propaganda machine on its domestic audiences. And they are working tirelessly 24/7 to brainwash the Russian people into believing that the Russian army is trying to save the Ukraine from fascist Nazis and save the population there, which is absolutely not true, of course, but the Russians believe in it.
Has there been any change of that over the 5-6 weeks of the war in terms of any sort of polling that shows what people actually believe?
Well, actually, when independent poll agencies like Levada Center or the Fond Общественное мнение, which is public opinion, those are two independent poll agencies in Russia, and the VTIOM, which is the government agency. This is an instance when their numbers are nearly similar. They're almost match. VTIOM reports that there are 73% of Russians who support Putin's decision, who support this war. They call it special operation, of course. And the other agencies, independent polling agencies, say that 63 to 67% of Russians support this war. And the change you mentioned is absolutely astonishing. 9% more Russians now support this war than it was a few weeks after the operation or war just started.
Yes.
In February. So we see increasingly more and more Russians supporting Putin and his regime and the war crimes they are committing in Ukraine.
Fatima, we've run out of time because we're about to take a short break, but thank you for that analysis in terms of the propaganda message from Moscow in the teeth of course, Ukrainian advances and evidence on the ground that is now being seen. And that's why President Zelensky visited Bucha to see for himself and talked about the genocide, the atrocities on the ground. And Joe Biden also saying again that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal. We'll have the thoughts of John Simpson. He's in Lviv at the moment. He's on the programme here in the next few minutes. Don't go away.
Hello there. In Europe, it's the southeast remains a place to be for some early spring warmth at the moment. Elsewhere, we've got this deep air of low pressure bringing some very windy conditions to the Baltic states, northern Europe, extensive snowfall through Finland, and another weather system which is still producing some pretty turbulent weather across southern parts of Spain and Portugal through Tuesday. Some very heavy rain in the southern costas, strong winds whipping up high seas as well. That's also affecting northern parts of Morocco, Algeria, and strong and cold winds through the likes of the Canaries. Northern parts of Spain and Portugal drier and brighter, and through central parts of Europe, okay, a bit breezy here, but it stays dry with some sunshine down towards the south and east. 30 the high there in Cyprus. Some sunny spells across the Balkans, but through Ukraine towards Germany, cloud outbreaks of rain, a little bit of sleet and snow on the northern edge. 40 centimetres of snow possible through Finland. More windy weather across northern Europe as you go through into Wednesday. Outbreaks of rain at times. Improving conditions though at long last for Spain and Portugal. But that means the wet weather has moved on through parts of central Italy, looking particularly wet as we go through Wednesday afternoon. That eventually pushing towards the Balkans. The outlook then for the rest of the week. London and Paris, further rain at times, not especially warm. London gets a bit colder through the end of the week. Temperatures lifting a little bit in Madrid. We're going to see the sunshine continue though in Athens. Stockholm staying on the cold side. Berlin, further unsettled weather this week.
The West is put on guard for Russian cyber attacks, but is business ready? I get the view from the former head of the NSA. I also talk about the threat the war poses to globalization with the head of the WTO. Join me, Aaron Heselhurst, on Talking Business Weekly, here on BBC World News.
The established international order has been upended by the invasion of Ukraine. Europe's decoupling from Russia, a historic split that's unlikely to be reversed so long as Putin is in power. So what does that mean? Join us for the context with me, Christian Fraser, Monday to Thursday, here on BBC World News.
Around this table, correspondents from across the globe who file, broadcast and blog from the Dateline London. Fresh perspectives on familiar stories and those you may know nothing about. Join us for a journalistic brains trust from those in the know. Dateline London weekends on BBC World News.
If you've got questions about the stories making headlines, Reality Check is here to help you get the facts straight. Our team of experts examine the evidence and cut through the spin. Join me, Chris Morris, here on BBC World News, or go to bbc.com/Reality Check.
This is BBC World News. I'm Matthew Amreliwala. On today's Global, Joe Biden adds his voice to international condemnation after more evidence emerges of atrocities by Russian forces. It comes as President Zelensky visits the town of Bucha and talks of his shock at seeing dead civilians on the streets and mass graves.
It's very difficult to talk when you see what they have done here. And day by day, they find bodies in cellars, people tortured, people killed.
We have to gather all the detail so this can be have a war crime trial. This guy is brutal, and what's happening in Bucha is outrageous, and everyone's seen it.
We'll get the analysis from our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, who's live in Lviv in western Ukraine. Also, this programme, an urgent plea from the world's leading researchers on climate change. We need to accelerate radical action to rein in catastrophic global warming. That's according to a UN report that's just been published. And Easter getaway chaos. EasyJet and British Airways cancel more than 100 flights due mainly to COVID-related absences. Hello and welcome back to BBC News. Shocking images of civilian bodies in the streets of Bucha near Kiev have led to international condemnation of Russia. Within the last hour or so, President Biden has again called Vladimir Putin a war criminal He's also called for increased sanctions and a war crimes trial. Meanwhile, Ukraine's president has been visiting Bucha, where he accused Russian troops of committing war crimes and genocide. Volodymyr Zelensky said Russian troops have treated people worse than animals, with that becoming increasingly clear when Ukrainian fighters retook territory. Well, the BBC's World Affairs editor John Simpson joins me live now from Lviv. And John, as Russian forces retreat from around Kyiv, the horrifying evidence is becoming increasingly clear, isn't it?
Yes, it's appalling stuff. I've been looking at some pictures today that we've been receiving here in Lviv from way away around Kiev, but it is absolutely appalling. It's the kind of thing that happens when soldiers aren't under proper military control and feel bitter, angry, and are just allowed by their officers to take out their revenge on ordinary people. It still, of course, has to be said that the Russian Defense Ministry is still denying any of this, says that it's just got up by the Ukrainian government and it's just all an invention, a provocation, they say, and the bodies aren't real. Well, I've seen quite a lot of bodies in my time in these sort of circumstances, and frankly, the pictures that I've seen look entirely genuine.
John, as you say, you have covered so many conflicts over decades. When it comes to war crimes, crimes against humanity, how tough will it be to actually get perpetrators into a dock?
Well, it's impossible until it suddenly happens. I mean, I think the best comparison really is what happened in Serbia after the Bosnian War. President Milosevic was overthrown in a revolution, and eventually it became possible to send him to The Hague. He died there during the whole proceedings. Radovan Karadzic had been the Bosnian Serbian leader, was discovered hiding and was tried, is serving a life sentence, in fact, in a British jail. And Ratko Mladic, who was responsible for the massacre at Srebrenica, was also captured, taken to The Hague, and is serving a lifetime sentence. What it takes is a change of government, a government which simply doesn't want all the baggage, the accusations, the terrible burden of what's been happening up to recently, and decides to hand over the guilty parties. Whether and how that will happen in Russia, it's absolutely impossible, of course, at the moment to say. But, I mean, there must be a reasonably good chance that something along those lines must happen.
Yes, President Zelensky, and he was viewing these scenes himself today and expressing his outrage. He made the point at one stage when talking to journalists that as more of the evidence is uncovered and Ukrainians see what Russians have actually been doing, it makes actually suing for peace so much more difficult. And I suppose that is probably true, isn't it?
Yeah, it must be true, of course. It's made more true and more, I suppose you could say, more difficult by the fact that President Zelensky has said that he'll only reach an agreement with the Russians as long as people in a referendum, people in Ukraine in a referendum, agree to the terms. And the kind of bitterness that the Bucha and perhaps other places, Mariupol, for instance, will generate in ordinary people if they're given the vote about whether to sue for peace or not, with whether to arrange peace terms or not with Russia. You know, that is going to be difficult. But on the other hand, there's no other way around this. I mean, yes, we're not just going to have a war that drags on and on and on. It's got to come to an end.
The evidence, though, of Russian military debris that we've seen over the last couple of days gives the lie to the Moscow claim that they weren't particularly interested in capturing Kyiv. But as they refocus on the east and the south, potentially things become easier to prosecute this war because supply lines are shorter, it's closer to territory they do control.
All of that's true, yes. I mean, they're saying their war aims in central Ukraine have been achieved. Well, you know, on the ground, it doesn't quite look like that, does it? But yes, it will be easier for them to carry out further attacks in the east and southeast. That's certainly true. But, you know, I mean, there's no way that Ukraine is going to get out of this without losing territory. It's a really hard thing to say to Ukrainian people, but this war will not end until President Putin has got enough of a case for saying he's scored a victory and then decides to sue for peace. It's a very, very hard thing to have to explain to people here, but that is the fact.
John, a final thought, because you're there in Lviv, and that is where the focus of so much of the humanitarian effort is actually based. The human consequences are pretty obvious, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. And I mean, all the way when I arrived yesterday from the Polish border, a lot of the road was filled with cars of people wanting to leave Ukraine and go to Poland. Nevertheless, the figures that I've been shown seem to indicate that people are starting to come back, that more people, in fact, are returning to Ukraine from Poland than are actually leaving. That may be just simply a moment that we've reached, but the chances are, I think, that a lot of people who left out of fear are starting to realize that the Russians aren't going to come anywhere near their territory. And so therefore they feel able to come back and take over their homes again.
John, we have to leave it there, but we'll talk again at the same time tomorrow. Thanks once again for joining us live from Lviv. Thank you. Now, it is Business Science. Samantha Simmons is here. And Sam, what do you have for us?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about this new report from the IPCC. Matthew, thank you. Well, it's a key report on climate change, and it's just been released within the past hour. And it pulls no punches. It says that rapid systemic transformation is needed across all parts of society to ensure that the world remains livable. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report demands the rapid phasing out of fossil fuels as the top priority, together with a major expansion of renewable energy. So how will the energy sector manage to do this? Let's talk now to Chaitanya Kumar, Head of Environment and Green Transition at the New Economics Foundation. Welcome to you. Thanks very much for being with us. You've seen this report. It really says time is of the essence. We've heard that, of course, many, many times in the past, but it says we have to act now, otherwise the effects are going to be irreversible. How far is the world off doing what it needs to do?
I think it's really important to understand the context in which this very important report is landing, because the impacts of climate change are being felt around the world. You know, we're seeing record-breaking extreme heat, flooding, wildfires, storms, droughts. It's getting worse and worse. The intensity and severity of climate impacts is getting worse. And I suppose the tragedy of it all is that those who contributed the least to this problem are paying the most in terms of lives and livelihoods. So when we talk about the solutions to this crisis, which is the central theme of this report, it is absolutely essential to understand where the initial responsibility lies. You know, the report is very clear. Every country needs to cut emissions, but richer, more developed nations need to go faster when it comes to cutting emissions and also supporting the other countries in transition. But, you know, one of the report authors was very, very clear when he said it's now or never when it comes to dealing with climate change. It's now or never when it comes to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And there hasn't been such a stark warning before. It's very clear to all governments in the world. And let's not forget, this report, the summary for policymakers, as it's called, has been approved by all the governments. So they know what's in it. They know what needs to happen. Now we just need to get on with it.
So a key part of this report is removing carbon from the atmosphere. It's called carbon capture. Just explain how far along we are in being able to do that and where governments stand.
We're not far, unfortunately. You would expect a technology that the report is suggesting we use a lot of moving forward. You'd expect it to be a lot more mature by now. But around the world, we roughly have about 27 carbon capture and storage plants. And the idea is very simple. You capture carbon before or after it's emitted while burning fossil fuels, and you remove them from the atmosphere and you put them underground for safe storage for millenniums ahead. That technology isn't ready at scale. As I said, only 27 plants operating around the world. So my biggest concern and fear with what is assumed or what is inferred from this report is governments acknowledging or realizing that we can keep continuing to burn fossil fuels and this miraculous technology will come along and save us because we can suck carbon from the atmosphere and put it in the ground forever.
OK, as you say, we can't do it just yet. Chaitanya Kumar, thanks very much for your analysis from the New Economics Foundation there. Now to the growing travel chaos in Europe as the Easter holidays begin. EasyJet has been forced to cancel around 100 flights today, including 62 from the UK. One of Europe's biggest airlines says it is grappling with unusual levels of staff absence due to COVID. Airports across the UK have been struggling with staff shortages. And on the water, crossing the Channel has proved challenging due to P&O ships still being out of action. Earlier, Simon Calder, travel correspondent for The Independent, told me more about why the situation has unravelled so quickly.
Yep, I'm at what used to be Europe's busiest airport, London Heathrow, and just when British Airways thought, and this is its main base, thought that things were suddenly getting better, we've had the removal of travel restrictions in the UK, of course, and increasingly across Europe. Unfortunately, they simply cannot cope with the level of demand. I've just counted the number of cancellations of short-haul flights to and from Heathrow exceeding 100. And that's just today. That represents about 15,000 people who are not going to get where they need to be. EasyJet, as you say, have been cancelling many flights across Europe. They, unfortunately, are up to, I calculate, around 150 cancellations across Europe today, more than 40 to and from their main base at Gatwick Airport. There's also cancellations from many airports across Europe. Yes, and looking at the crossing the Channel, well, we have a big industrial dispute involving P&O ferries and their plan to make a lot of crew redundant. So 3 big ferries tied up at Dover, problems in the Channel Tunnel between France and England. That has gummed up the usual alternative to ships. And unfortunately, exactly as you say, Easter holidays beginning for many schools across Europe, demand suddenly returning to pre-pandemic levels as families seize the opportunity for their first holiday generally for 2 years. And, well, everything is unravelling very fast.
Simon Calder there. That's it from me. Matthew, back to you.
Samantha, thanks very much. We'll have more on that climate change report here in just a moment or two. Don't go away.
Now from BBC Real.
My culinary adventure begins south of Baku at a sustainable caviar fish farm located in the historical sturgeon spawning area between the Kura River and the Caspian Sea.
There's thousands of them. The earliest chance to get a caviar is 3 years, but for example, beluga, it matures for 12 to 15 years. Wow. Before it's ready to bring the caviar.
There has been a worldwide ban on wild sturgeon caviar since 2006. So the caviar you can buy comes from places like here. Rufat tells me Baku Caviar is on a mission to replenish the fish stock in the Caspian Sea.
For every jar that you purchase, we release 10 fishes into the wild.
They keep bobbing up and down.
They are kids and they want to play.
Rufat shows me the fish they're processing today for the caviar and the fish meat.
This is a blonde beluga, and it's very valuable caviar that they will produce.
So the caviar has just been extracted from the sturgeon, and here the caviar master, they're responsible for panning it to make sure that what you're left with here is the beautiful caviar.
And that is so creamy. It's kind of a nutty taste. It's really delicious.
Original global stories from the BBC.
Welcome back to Global here on BBC World News. Now, within the last hour, as you've been hearing, the world's leading researchers on climate change have warned that rapid systemic transformation is needed across all parts of society to rein in catastrophic global warming. Well, the UN Secretary General has described the IPCC report as a file of shame.
The jury has reached a verdict, and it is damning. This report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a litany of broken climate promises. It is a file of shame, cataloguing the empty pledges that put us firmly on track towards an unlivable world. We are on a fast track to climate disaster. Major cities underwater, unprecedented heat waves, terrifying storms, widespread water shortages, the extinction of 1 million species of plants and animals. And this is not fiction or exaggeration. It is what science tells us will result from our current energy policies. We are on a pathway to global warming of more than double the 1.5 degree limit agreed in Paris. Some government and business leaders are saying one thing but doing another. Simply put, they are lying. And the results will be catastrophic.
Antonio Guterres, very strong words from the Secretary General. Let's talk now to Kathy Boffman-McLeod from the Arch Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Centre. Thank you so much for joining us live from Washington. Do you agree with the principal conclusions from this report? It is effectively now or never.
Absolutely, yes. It is now or never. The pathways for us to sustain ourselves, our biodiversity, our food supplies, our health, our economies, that window is closing very rapidly.
Take us through the adaptation that is actually required, that you think.
Well, and when we talk about climate change, we talk about it in terms of mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is the effort to stop emitting the greenhouse gases. Adaptation is for us to adjust and change and build things that help us protect ourselves from all of the impacts of climate change, like fires, floods, droughts, especially extreme heat, hurricanes. And so those are things that build resilience for communities, and they are structural things like seawalls, and there are nature-based solutions. There are ways that we change our policies for when people are exposed to extreme heat. And so we need a full and very rapid shift to adapt to protect especially the most vulnerable people in the planet who had the least to do with this warming, driving all of this catastrophe, to protect those lives and livelihoods.
I know you specialise in that area around extreme heat. What are the sort of temperatures that we're going to be dealing with or are dealing with? And I mean away from fires, just places that are having to deal day to day with extraordinary temperatures. I mean, what do you actually do about that?
Well, when you think about heat and the growing temperatures, we also have the exacerbating factors of the cities and the way that we've built our cities. So we have asphalt that absorbs heat and then emits it at night. We have other materials, rooftops that don't help cool but actually make it hotter. And so we have this urban heat island effect in cities. And so it's hotter and then hotter yet. And it's hurting our health. It's also picking our pockets. And so we assessed the cost of extreme heat to workers in the US alone at $100 billion. In 2020, there are things that we can do. We can change those surfaces. We can paint the roofs lighter color. We can do green roofs. Nature is a great solution. Urban forests, changing worker hours, all sorts of things that we can do. And we need to do them quickly, and we need to deploy money and financing to do them.
Kathy, I'm unfortunately
As the sun rises over the Caspian, get ready to embrace the day. Come and listen to the whispering sea make the most of Azerbaijan with its mountainous beauty. Just stop for a second. Take in the incredible landscapes. Experience them every way you can. Reconnect with nature. Set your spirit free. Azerbaijan, take another look.
Hello there, welcome to a roundup of the big world weather stories heading our way over the next few days. We're going to start in the northwest United States first of all. Cascades, northern Rockies, over 3 foot of snow possible Monday into Tuesday as this area of low pressure passes its way eastwards. But it's not just about the snow, the strength of the wind as well. Eastern Washington State, Oregon into Idaho and Montana, 70 to 100 mile an hour gusts through Monday night, which into Tuesday transfer down the eastern side of the Rockies as far south as Colorado. Not only travel disruption, there could be some major damage to go with that too. And whilst all that's happening across the deep south, severe storms developing. Eastern parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Mississippi, Louisiana, they will spread the way through Georgia towards the Carolinas. And heavy rain, strong winds also through towards Washington and New York Tuesday night and into Wednesday. But it's across the deep south the greatest concern of the severe weather. Not only through Tuesday into Wednesday could we see some pretty torrential rain and flash flooding, but there will be a tornado risk too. Now, I'm going to stick with the flash flooding thing. We've seen some severe storms across the Rio region in Brazil recently. More to come just to the west, I think, on Tuesday. Some of the worst of storms in South America, though, on Tuesday will be further north. And to Europe now on Tuesday, where in the north a deep area of low pressure spreading across Finland is set to produce huge amounts of snow, about 40 centimetres for some, strong winds blowing that around. And of course we've seen areas of low pressure hit Spain and Portugal, another one Monday into Tuesday. More heavy rains, southern Portugal, mainly to the south and east of Spain. That could cause some flooding, strong winds, rough seas as well. It transfers its way though through to central parts of Italy on Wednesday, things improving further west. Now, this area of low pressure is a developing tropical cyclone. It's going to hit New Caledonia, push down the west with damaging winds, rough seas. At the same time, as if March wasn't wet enough, Sydney is set to see more storms through the rest of this week across New South Wales, potentially the Capital Territory as well. 100 to 200 millimetres of rain with yet further flash flooding. We'll keep you updated.
The NioBolt cell is the same size and weight as a traditional lithium-ion one, but it can power things better whilst it's doing the job, and crucially, it charges a lot faster. The eventual aim? 3 minutes compared to 3 hours. And here in this lab, batteries are being tested, along with visualisations of their charging speed, heating and the current. The cells are then grouped together and tested in regular devices.
It's possible to charge batteries in 5 minutes. We've had robotic vacuum cleaners charge in 3 minutes. It's possible to charge power tools in 10 minutes or less.
Much of the success here lies in the development of a new material which allows lithium ions to transfer quickly at a safe temperature.
The heating that you get, primarily because your anode and your cathode materials are not able to move lithium ions fast enough, and then the heating causes a whole series of degradation. The electrolyte decomposes, the cathode decomposes, giving off oxygen and causes fires.
But even having addressed this, there are still challenges for the fast charging of the thing that many of us care about the most, our smartphones. Years of miniaturising their components despite their subsequent growing screen sizes has made this more difficult.
These limitations come from the components, so like the wires and the connectors, and usually they're limited to about 5 amps. That's what you have in most of the USB sockets. So USB-C's got to go to its next generation that can allow for faster charging. And the chargers, you've got to have chargers that wouldn't become too big and bulky to carry around too.
Vehicle charging is on the agenda too. When it comes to recharging electric vehicles, there are a lot of variables. This isn't exactly your standard electric car. Right now, to fully power up something like this would take about 3 hours. Now, that's partly because the initial bit of that charging happens quite fast and then it slows down later on. But these batteries should overcome that problem, making it possible to reach full charge in just 5 to 6 minutes.
Driverless taxi pods could spend more time shuttling people rather than sitting charging.
The company's also been busy working on this prototype mobile charging device. The idea is it could be used on building sites or maybe to even charge cars. It can move forwards and backwards from side to side. And here you've got 3 detachable batteries. They only take 3 minutes to charge. There are also AC sockets here. And thanks to 2,000 cells inside, it can provide 30 kilowatts of power. That's about the same as a Tesla Powerwall.
There are still other issues to be overcome. What happens to the battery at the end of its life? And there are some compromises.
If you don't mind an additional 10% lower runtime or 20% lower runtime, but you're able to get all that energy in 5 minutes, this is something that our technology allows.
Once the lab trials are finished, it'll be time for industrial testing and validation, in the hope that these fast-charging batteries could be speeding up our lives in the next few years.
This is BBC World News. I'm Matthew Emery-Waller. Joe Biden adds his voice to the international condemnation after more evidence emerges of atrocities by Russian forces. It comes as President Zelensky visits the town of Bucha and talks of his shock at seeing dead civilians on the streets and mass graves.
It's very difficult to talk when you see what they have done here. And day by day, they find bodies in cellars, people tortured, people killed.
We have to gather all the detail so this can be have a war crime trial. This guy is brutal, and what's happening in Bucha is outrageous, and everyone's seen it.
Russia claims the images are staged, but the BBC films evidence and hears first-hand accounts of civilians being killed.
They were in jeeps with guns. They killed him and fled. How can I talk to such morons? I want them dead. I want their children to lie like my son.
Also coming up on today's Global, an urgent plea from the world's leading researchers on climate change. As the latest UN report on climate is published, the Secretary-General accuses governments and businesses of lying about their efforts to tackle climate change. And political turmoil in Pakistan. The Supreme Court deliberates whether blocking a vote of no confidence against the Prime Minister Imran Khan was legitimate. Welcome to today's Global. Shocking images of civilian bodies in the streets of Bucha near Kyiv have led to international condemnation of Russia. In the last hour, President Biden has again called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. He's also called for increased sanctions and a war crimes trial. Meanwhile, Ukraine's president has been visiting Bucha, where he accused Russian troops of committing war crimes and genocide. Volodymyr Zelensky said Russian troops have treated people worse than animals, with that becoming increasingly clear when Ukrainian fighters retook territory. We'll get the latest from Ukraine in a moment or two, but first let's start with this from President Biden.
You may remember I got criticized for calling Putin a war criminal. Well, the truth of the matter, you saw what happened in Bucha. This warrants him, he is a war criminal. But we have to gather the information. We have to continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons they need to continue the fight. And we have to gather all the detail so this can be have a war crime trial. This guy is brutal. And what's happening in Bucha is outrageous. And everyone's seen it. No, I think it is a war crime.
Well, that was President Biden. Let's hear now from our correspondent Anna Foster, who's in Lviv. And she began by talking about President Zelensky's outrage when he saw for himself the scenes on a visit to Bucha.
It's notable as well that we see President Zelensky in the town of Bucha. So far through this conflict, we've seen him almost daily in the surrounds of Kyiv, of course. You have to remember that there is an ongoing threat to his safety as the president of this country. But today he has been to Bucha. He has seen for himself some of those images that have been beamed around the world in the last 48 hours or so. Bucha has endured 5 weeks or so now of near constant firefights, and now officials and human rights groups are blaming the civilian deaths on the departing Russian forces. Let's have a listen to what President Zelensky had to say.
You can see around what was done to this modern town. That's a characteristic of Russian soldiers that treat people worse than animals. That is real genocide. What you have seen here today, what you can see, what happened. We know thousands of people that were tortured and killed, with cut off hands and legs, extremities, and what they did to the women. And I would say that the longer the Russian Federation will drag out the meeting process, the worse will be for them and, in principle, for this situation, for this war. Because with every day when our army are moving into the previously occupied territory, you can see what's happening. It's very difficult to talk when you see what they have done here. And day by day, they find bodies in cellars, people tortured, people killed. So if they have something to think with, they have to think quick.
Well, we are seeing now those images from places like Bucha, which we've seen so little from for the last 5 weeks, but we're also beginning to hear as well the stories and the testimony of people who lived through, frankly, unimaginable scenes there. I've been speaking to some residents of Bucha, people who managed to escape from that town, the areas which have been left devastated during this war. Ukrainian fears have now become reality. In towns around the capital, Kyiv, horrific scenes are slowly revealed to the world. Destruction and death now inhabit these once quiet streets. Places like Bucha have been scarred forever.
Why were ordinary civilians in an ordinary peaceful city tortured to death?